Hey there, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today it's a big one, the newest project from Clipping, Dead Channel Sky. So I can argue that from 2013 to 2020, Clipping were at the forefront of some of the most impressive experimental hip-hop of that era. Stellar rapping from Davi Diggs, replete with detail and visceral energy that could deliver mind-breaking bangers, complete with production that could take sounds and noise in directions you would never expect, into high-concept experiences unlike any other. And thus, I wasn't that surprised it took a while to get another Clipping album. It's not like Davi Diggs is short on things to do, given his acting and producing work, and thus when they announced a cyberpunk project with an Aesop rock guest feature, well, that was way too much up my alley to ignore. And I also knew I needed to give this the proper time to really sink in. Clipping albums are dense and challenging by design. They nearly always grow on me, and I wanted to ensure this had the proper chance for that to happen. Fully understand and contextualize where they were going this time. They were looking to draw the explicit parallels between the era of hackers and cyberpunk from the 80s and 90s, and, well, the early hip-hop of that same era, a tangle of dystopian fiction, Afrofuturism, and by extension, innovations in electronic music drawn from black club culture that underscore them both, from drum and bass to acid house, from big beat to trip-hop, all hoping that you would ignore other cyberpunk albums that didn't work from around that era, like from Billy Idol in 1993. Now, if you know your underground rap, specifically from the late 90s, cyberpunk is not that far afield from what was getting referenced by rappers on Def Jux, like LP of Company Flow, or Cannibalox. But the more explicit parallel that I saw was Deltron 3030 and that classic album from 2000, but that was also slightly misleading around this. For as much as Dead Channel Sky is a reference to William Gibson's Neuromancer, this is not structured like a classic, straightforward narrative so much as a self-described mixtape. Hell, the trio themselves compared it to the original Blade soundtrack album, and a blurry anthology of ideas spanning so many possible dystopian nows, where the edge manifests like all those sci-fi anthologies of the past, and how many could actually come to pass, or indeed already have. In other words, what the last two Clipping albums did in terms of horror anthologies, drawing the explicit parallel to the Black experience in a mosaic of nightmares, this is doing it for cyberpunk. It's certainly nerdier and more niche, a similar assessment I'd make of the last time Clipping touched sci-fi on the space opera Splendor and Misery from 2016, but the tone and framing is a little different. It's scrappier, it's dense, but it's more direct and, well, kind of punk in its attitude. And for the first time in comparison with how forward-thinking Clipping usually are, this might feel a little bit more backwards looking, calling back to a very deliberate reference point that to the kids might as well feel alien, but any nerd in their 30s or older, they're gonna recognize the second we hear dial-up. And I reference Cyberpunk by Billy Idol for a reason, not just because he might have actually been onto something in attempting to make the parallel between Black revolutionary action and cyberpunk on Shock to the System all those decades ago and just utterly mishandled the execution, but also making such cyberpunk material feel intense, relevant, scary, and as impressively atmospheric as what Clipping usually have. Well, that's a bigger challenge if you've got a pre-built preconception of what that era was like, or you remember a lot of the media that couldn't recognize that vision at the time. And thus going into this album, well, it's a little frustrating because on paper, it makes a lot of sense. It's stuff full of cool ideas that would make sense together, but I'm not sure the execution is as potent as it could be. And that leaves me torn because I want to find this a lot more viscerally compelling than I think I actually do. Part of the problem is atmosphere. When Clipping is at their best, the mixes feel immense and haunting, even if they are somewhat spare on the details, and you really accentuate that negative space. And where you'd think the noise and glitch of early internet cyberspace would be a perfect fit for that warped imagination, but many of these mixes feel oily and sterile and bare, split by noise interludes that feel like they should add up to a lot more beyond killing the momentum. Hell, Go sounds like it's trying to trigger tinnitus amidst the rumbling grind for such an abortive song. I don't know, maybe the howling changed the channel, set the bar way too high for the bangers on this album because that kicked ass. But if you're looking for the next enlacing, I'm not sure this has one. Or for another example, as much as the chic, druggy nightclub experience shows up in so much cyberpunk to be borderline cliche, the atmosphere when they attempt it feels a bit hemmed in, limited, short on melody, sometimes through the tonal selections that lean on techno, which is not normally my thing, but sometimes by the feeling that they're not embracing the alien and psychedelic side of this sci-fi subgenre to get as weird as they really could, even with the eerie noise interludes that seem to hang disconnected around mixes that again feel increasingly spare, which reminds me of how Splendor and Misery could also be so frustrating, going back to similar territory. Take Scams, where I'm reminded of when Clipping used a similar glassy bass palette when they flipped Tipsy a while back, and it doesn't quite feel as special or imposing, especially compared to when Polaroids takes that same brittleness into this bubbly industrial grind. Run It gets a little bit more gurgling and ugly with the glitchy pivots, and Malleus gets Nels Cline, the experimental guitarist of Wilco, to show up for a jagged warping passage, but they feel kind of like the exception, not the rule, especially when it's more organic. I don't know, the grooves are of course impeccably balanced, but I wish the synths felt a little bit more analog or ragged or tuneful. Maybe not go for the obvious vaporwave or darkwave touch points, those have been overexposed, but enabling those dance grooves of the past to feel a little bit more visceral or weird, pull you into the atmosphere, like with Code having some organic glassy touches, the strings and the field recording touches in both the Splendor and Misery callback, and fit some of that old school swagger, or the metallic hammer of Welcome Home Warrior that reminded me a lot of Aesop Rock's own Spirit World Field Guide, which kind of felt natural for cyberpunk, or how Ask What Happened takes the haunted bells and gothic synths into a great drum and bass crescendo. You can also tell that to make that callback to the 80s and 90s, Clipping were screaming to add more samples, but for as immense and grinding as Dominator is, made that sound flipping the titular 1991 banger, I was waiting for the melodic shift that put it on a different level, and it didn't quite coalesce. Hell, Keep Pushing has its drug running married to a muted sung hook that has Davi Diggs sounding a little like Open Mike Eagle, which funnily enough worked a lot for me, more than the warbling low synths that sound removed from a 90s LucasArts game on Mood Organ, but they don't actually lead to a hook, or the oddly conventionally sounding chilly French house of Mirrorshades Part 2, where I kept expecting that next gear and we didn't really get it. But was there even a desire for them to get that twisted? Again, I think Clipping can be at their best hitting the pure nightmare fuel with an uncanny catchiness alongside the dense wordplay, where the metaphors get punishingly visceral and feel frighteningly relevant, and that goes back to the self-titled album with cuts like Body and Blood. But for as much as the framing is drawing the parallel to nowadays in historical cycles, and there is some political resonance we'll get into, it initially feels like there should be more modern internet reference points to stitch it back beyond a D's nuts joke on Code. How the history of cyberpunk in the 80s and 90s feel tangibly grounded to the modern hellscape. Because while it is there thematically, and how every bit of technology seems to be corroding at the edges, which broadly translates to some of the album's aesthetic, it doesn't always get there texturally in the writing, which matters if you're trying to avoid those older reference points from feeling a little bit kitschy. And again, it's not saying the text of Davi Diggs doesn't feel insightful or poignant in the setting. I love how Dominator approaches the glorious descent into corporate-controlled cyberspace, but also how that futurism should include trans rights. It makes sense in a digital era. And then tightly following it with the scrappy but bruising hacker panic of Change the Channel. Perfect. I like how Code deliberately infuses gang code with cyber double entendres, splicing in samples from the 1996 Afrofuturism documentary The Last Angel of History. I can appreciate how Madcap takes the anxious striving within the bad system and then translates it to the dark dance floor nihilism of Mirrorshades Part 2, where death feels like that chilly inevitability around every corner. And Scams continues Clipping's proud tradition of women being as vicious and bloodthirsty and exploiting men in their wake, especially given how a lot of guys to this day get antsy with scammers while endorsing far more violent crimes in their hip-hop. But then you get the pulse-pounding drum and bass of Dodger, where it shows someone who bought into the system observing it being hacked and then collapsing around her, and how she becomes kind of enamored with that revolutionary cause. And while it feels damn near cinematic as the mix expands for the final verse, it's a pretty amazing song to boot. It initially feels a little incongruent congruent with the rest of the atmosphere on the album, maybe even too optimistic for this setting. In contrast, compare this to Welcome Home Warrior with Aesop Rock, full of those rich, grainy synths that speaks explicitly to gamification, and how so many individuals, let's be honest, men, are primed to be the hero in their own story online, complete with callbacks to sword and sorcery fantasy, but when it's divorced from actual reality and it's in a corporate-controlled framework, that's not revolutionary. It's the fight getting co-opted. And that was the rub with a lot of cyberpunk and futurism in its wake coming out of the late 90s. The aesthetic was often so compelling for the technology fetishists that they missed the message that explicitly foretold every reason why so much of it was a bad idea if implemented. It's taking the wrong lessons from Black Mirror. The big reason I think this album could have afforded to get a lot darker and weirder, so that point wasn't missed. Now granted, when you pack on the throwback dance techno grooves and Davi Diggs flowing in triple time, it's inevitable some of the message is going to get subsumed. And while I think the noisier interludes are supposed to prompt the contemplation of some of that darkness, I don't know, I'm not sure it worked. To me, they felt more obtuse than actively challenging or thought-provoking. But I don't know, maybe there's another angle here. And that has to do with Clipping purposefully leaving a portion of the intro track off the digital version of the album. It's only available on CD. Now, the scavenger hunt is widely accepted among cyberpunks. Cute little Easter egg in the same way every callback to Splendor and Misery is, until you realize an alternative fan title of the song is Story 036 Indexing Error. And honestly, it completely reframes Dead Channel Sky, because not only do we get a direct link to the story sequence of tracks across their catalog, it highlights the meta text of those story songs, becoming the cultural coded reference to pass down information, ideas, themes. And that was quintessential across cyberpunk, where digital information control is such a central idea. Also relevant to hip-hop, because how much of quasi-legal sampling has left that golden age never able to make streaming platforms, and then the information gets lost, which is why outside the budget, this album is so short on samples outside the most obvious, like Dominator. Now, Polaroids is also one of the best songs on this album because it shows the history of what the world could have been that corporations want you to forget outside of their sanitized, controlled, digital brand of it. That you know what has been lost, that you could have been better, then that you can actually build back if you hold on to it. And it allows Ask What Happened to feel like the thematic bookend, as it takes the history of that era that predates cyberpunk with the political context and then collapses it into the cavalcade of present-day worlds, from the 70s to the 80s to now, linking through the relevance of that storytelling tradition, the conditions that led to all this, and what it can indeed inspire. It's why Dodger then makes sense on the album. It's also why the framing allows room for everyday people to breathe, try to live in this space, maybe even find pleasure, not judging them for drug abuse or scamming or even trying to aspire in the bad system. We all gotta get by somehow. Clipping gets that. But all of it leads to an album that's got a lot of potent moments, a lot of great ideas. It feels thematically rich, frequently sticking the landing, amidst a diffuse structure where the production feels kind of airless, lacking a lot of melody. The momentum is hopelessly stymied, and you're left thinking that this should hit a lot harder than it does. Going back to Splendor and Misery, one of the reasons that album continues to frustrate me nearly a decade later is this twinge of insularity, where it'll feel very rewarding if you unlock every single Easter egg, but it loses some accessibility in its wake if you don't, and that absolutely comes back here. Don't get me wrong, the meta commentary about the historical lineage of stories and the interweaving connections between cyberpunk and hip-hop, they're legit fascinating, drenched in the iconography of both to highlight tangible common ground. But if you're gonna lean on some of that tangible revolutionary sentiment that underscores a lot of cyberpunk, particularly nowadays, going on nerdy, self-referential tangles and obtuse swerves, it kind of runs at cross purposes to your populism and any sense of urgency. And look, I fully recognize it's not Clipping's fault that the stupidest of the 1%, especially in the tech sector, decided they wanted to speedrun the dystopia, and I might be looking for something more radical or outwardly political in order to match my current energy. You gotta review the album you get, not the one you want. I understand I don't want to be unfair here. And Clipping are the act where every listen and pushes them closer to greatness. I know it's only going to further grow on me after the 10 listens I've already given it. But I'm also going to say it. It's not my favorite Clipping album, and I'm not sure it'll get there. It's damn close to great, but it's not better than the self-titled album or Visions of Bodies Being Burned, at least to me. That being said, this is absolutely worth your time. Very few acts will ever sound like Clipping. Even with some of my reservations, it still kind of feels cutting edge in its production more often than not. It's dense as all hell, the wordplay's phenomenal, and Davi Diggs' gift with flow and thematic depth is truly remarkable. And I don't know, if this album doesn't convince you to find certain channels that are a little off the common grid, can't argue with that. You'll see. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe. I gotta be honest, this album was kind of frustrating. I gave this a ton of listens, really trying to untangle and decode everything. I still know that there's a lot of other references that are gonna have certain fact finders. All the busy, all the further. Enjoy your Reddit. I feel at some point I got to the thematic depth, and that's what really worked for me. And again, finding track 0 really put it over the top. But again, I still have kind of high standards for Clipping, and I was really hoping we get something on the tier of Enlacing or Story 2, or even Air 'em Out. Not sure there is that here. It happens. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if y'all want to get involved in helping support the channel, get albums on my schedule, yell at me on my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over here. Also to YouTube memberships. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I certainly understand, but option is available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.